Have you ever heard of a man so guarded that he banned all women from entering his sanctuary? Imagine a billionaire on Banana Island, Femi Adebayo, a man with a heart as cold as his air-conditioned mansion and a bedroom that is a fortress against the female gender. But what happens when that ironclad rule is broken? Not by a seductress, but by an innocent maid who is fast asleep? What happens when the Iron King wakes up to find the one thing he forbade lying right in his arms? In today's story, we step into the world of Nigerian modern luxury, forbidden boundaries, and a stormy night that changes everything. If you love stories about unexpected romance, billionaire secrets, and the twists of fate, please hit that like button right now. It helps us bring more of these stories to you. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a chapter. Now, let's open the doors to the sanctuary. The morning sun over the Lagos Lagoon didn't just rise, it announced itself. It spilled liquid gold over the dark, brackish water, hitting the glass facade of Femi Adebayo's mansion on Banana Island like a physical force. Inside the master suite, the silence was absolute. Femi Adebayo woke up at 5:30 a.m. as he did every day without an alarm. He lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling. It was a masterpiece of architectural minimalism. Drop-down panels of dark walnut wood with recessed mood lighting that mimicked the soft glow of dawn. He sat up, the sheets, charcoal gray Egyptian cotton, cool to the touch, falling away from his chest. He was a man carved from granite and regret. At 35, Femi was the CEO of Apex Switch, the fintech giant that processed half the transactions in West Africa. He had everything a man could want, and he had ensured that the one thing that could hurt him, a woman, was systematically barred from his sanctuary. He pressed a button on the floating bedside console. The blackout blinds, made of heavy, automated fabric, hummed softly and rose. The entire south wall was glass, revealing the panoramic view of the Lekki Ikoyi Link Bridge in the distance, standing like a harp against the skyline. A soft knock came at the heavy mahogany double doors. "Enter," Femi commanded, his voice rough with sleep. The door opened and Samuel, his personal valet, stepped in. Samuel was 50, efficient and male. That was the most important qualification for anyone allowed on the second floor. "Good morning, sir. Your espresso is ready. The gym is prepped." Femi nodded, swinging his legs out of bed. His feet touched the rug, a custom-woven piece from the north, thick wool dyed in indigo patterns reminiscent of ancient Adair cloth, but modernized into geometric shapes. "Any issues downstairs, Samuel?" "New staff arrival today, sir. A cleaning girl. Mama Nkechi is handling it." Femi's expression tightened. "You know the protocol." "Yes, sir," Samuel said, bowing slightly. "She has been briefed. The upper floor is a restricted zone. No female staff past the bronze lions on the landing. Ever." Femi stood up, walking toward the bathroom. The walls were clad in split-faced travertine stone, and the vanity was a slab of raw, polished granite. "Make sure she understands, Samuel. I don't want to see her. I don't want to smell her perfume. I don't want to know she exists." Downstairs, the house was waking up, but the atmosphere was far less serene. The kitchen was a cavern of industrial luxury. Stainless steel appliances gleamed under stark white lighting, softened only by the cabinetry made of warm, honey-toned Irako wood. A massive island in the center, topped with black quartz, served as the command center for the head housekeeper, Mama Nkechi. She stood with her hands on her hips, her gaze drilling into the young woman standing nervously by the service entrance. "What is your name again?" Mama Nkechi barked, though her voice wasn't unkind, just heavy with authority. "Adana, Ma," the girl whispered. Adana was petite, with skin the color of deep polished mahogany and large, expressive eyes that currently looked terrified. She wore the house uniform, a crisp gray tunic and trousers, which hung slightly loose on her slender frame. She clutched her hands together to stop them from shaking. She needed this job. The salary for a junior maid in this house was more than a bank teller made in the mainland. "Listen to me, Adana," Mama Nkechi said, stepping closer. "This house is not like other houses. You see this floor?" She pointed to the ground. Adana looked down. The flooring was exquisite, poured polished concrete, inlaid with thin strips of brass that caught the light, leading the eye through the open-plan living space. "You clean this floor. You clean the living room. You clean the guest bathrooms. You clean the kitchen," Mama Nkechi listed, ticking off fingers. "But you see those stairs?" Adana followed her finger to the grand staircase. It was a floating design, the steps made of thick slabs of wood protruding from a stone feature wall, appearing to defy gravity. At the top of the stairs, flanking the landing, stood two life-sized bronze leopards, their heads lowered in a silent snarl. "I see them, Ma." That is the border, Mama Nkechi said, her voice dropping to a whisper. Beyond those leopards is the kingdom of Oga Femi. No woman crosses that line. Not you. Not me. Not the president's wife. If you put one toe on that top landing, you are fired before you can blink. Do you hear me? Yes, Ma. I hear you. Good. Oga does not like women in his space. He had a very bad experience. He pays us well to be invisible. If he walks into a room, you look down. You step back. You become part of the furniture. Are we clear? Crystal clear, Ma. Adana nodded vigorously. She didn't want trouble. She just wanted to work, save money, and perhaps send some back to her mother in Enugu. Good. Start with the dusting. The art lounge. Adana moved into the main living area and her breath hitched. She had seen rich houses in movies, but this was art. The art lounge was a sunken seating area. The sofas were low, upholstered in a burnt orange velvet that contrasted with the cool concrete walls. But it was the decor that mesmerized her. It was proudly, apologetically African. A massive, carved wooden door from Zanzibar had been repurposed as a coffee table, covered in glass. On the walls, vibrant, chaotic paintings by modern Lagos artists depicted market scenes and traffic jams, bursting with color against the stark gray walls. Tall, woven baskets from the Niger Delta stood in corners, holding towering fiddle-leaf fig trees that reached for the skylights. It was beautiful. It was intimidating. As Adana dusted a sculpture of a stylized Fulani milkmaid, she heard the heavy tread of footsteps on the stairs. The rhythm was fast, purposeful. He is coming, one of the other maids, Beezy, hissed, grabbing Adana's arm and pulling her back against the wall. Heads down. Adana lowered her head, staring at her canvas shoes. Femi Adebayo descended the stairs. He was wearing a navy blue bespoke suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. He smelled of expensive sandalwood and crisp linen. He moved with the energy of a storm trapped in a bottle. He didn't look at them. He walked past them as if they were statues, his eyes fixed on the tablet in his hand, checking stock prices. Samuel, have the car brought around, he said, his voice a deep baritone that seemed to vibrate through the floor. It is waiting, sir, Samuel replied, trailing behind him. Adana dared to peek up through her lashes. She saw his profile, sharp, handsome, and utterly unsmiling. He looked like a man who carried the weight of the world and hated every ounce of it. The heavy front door slammed shut, and the house seemed to exhale. While a man, Beezy whispered, relaxing her posture. But he pays on time. Adana let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She could handle this. She could be invisible. She could follow the rules. She went about her day, scrubbing and polishing, marveling at the luxury. She worked hard, tiring her body out, hoping that the exhaustion would keep her mind quiet. She didn't tell anyone about the condition that had plagued her since childhood. She didn't tell them about the nights she walked while sleeping, her subconscious seeking things her waking mind denied her. She assumed that if she locked her door in the servants' quarters, she would be safe. She assumed the bronze leopards would keep her out. She was wrong. The storm did not arrive. It assaulted Banana Island. By 11 p.m., the humidity of the day had condensed into fat, aggressive drops that hammered the mansion's vast windows. The power grid flickered with an exhausted sigh before the massive, silent generators in the basement roared to life, restoring the equilibrium. In the staff quarters, a small, neat room tucked away in the service wing, Adana lay wide awake. The relentless drumming of the rain against her window pane, combined with the stress of starting the new high-stakes job, had her nerves frayed. Sleep had always been a complicated refuge for her. She had done everything Mama Nkechi asked, secured the small metal-framed bed, pulled the thin cotton blanket tight, and triple-checked the lock on her door. She was terrified of the somnambulism, not because of where she might go, but because of the deep, visceral shame she felt when she woke up in unexpected places. In this house, wandering meant instant ruin. Finally, sometime past midnight, exhaustion won. Her mind, battered by the sound of the tropical deluge, surrendered. Adana's eyes were open, but the lights were out. She was no longer the tired, anxious maid. She was a quiet, seeking creature moving through the dark. Her subconscious had taken the helm, and its singular directive was simple: seek shelter. Seek warmth. The staff quarters felt too cold, too exposed. Her body moved with a liquid grace her waking self did not possess. She unlocked her door, a simple, practiced movement, and stepped into the service hallway. The Irako wood paneling felt cool beneath her fingertips as she trailed along the wall, navigating by muscle memory. She bypassed the kitchen, avoiding the sudden brightness of the motion sensor lights. Her feet, bare and silent, found the sleek, cool expanse of the polished concrete floor in the main hall. The house was a temple of silent, expensive comfort, but to her sleeping mind, it was a maze. She began to ascend the floating wooden staircase. The security system, designed to detect unauthorized activity, registered her only as a shift in air pressure, quickly dismissed by the ongoing storm outside. At the top of the stairs, the two bronze leopards stood guard. Their fierce, silent snarls were meant to ward off intruders, but Adana's subconscious mind did not recognize warnings. It only registered the faint warmth emanating from the inner corridor, a core heat maintained by Femi's tightly controlled environment. She stepped onto the landing, brazenly crossing the invisible boundary that guaranteed her immediate dismissal. The thick carpet here muffled her steps entirely. She was in the upper kingdom. The hallway leading to the master suite was dark, lit only by soft, indirect strips of LED light that grazed the textured stone walls. She reached the colossal mahogany double doors. These were not meant to be opened by staff. They were sealed by electronic locks and heavy, well-oiled hinges. During the power flicker an hour earlier, the automated locking sequence had briefly cycled, requiring a manual re-engagement that Samuel, confident in the storm's fury and the staff's terror, had neglected. The bolt was retracted. Adana placed her hand on the cold mahogany. The door yielded with an almost theatrical silence. Femi Adebayo's master suite was a hushed cave of luxury. The massive walnut bed, the source of radiating human heat, was the focal point. In his sleep, Femi was completely unguarded. The stress lines around his eyes were smoothed out, and his arm rested heavily across the vast expanse of the 10-foot bed, claiming the space. He had sought comfort in isolation, in the sheer absence of another body. Adana, driven by the profound need of her sleeping self, walked straight to the bed. She didn't consciously see the billionaire. She saw only a huge, safe space and the promise of warmth against the chill that seemed to cling to her skin. She lifted the heavy, expensive duvet and slipped beneath the covers. She shifted, her small body seeking the thermal mass of the man beside her. She didn't choose the side of the bed, she chose the center of the heat. When Adana nestled against Femi's back, her bare arm brushing his side, his body's reaction was primal. He was asleep, far from the rules of his waking mind. His muscles shifted, and he turned, pulling the intruder toward him, a deep, reflexive action of a lonely man seeking comfort. His arm clamped around her waist, locking her securely against his chest. His chin found the soft curve of her head. He inhaled deeply, catching the faintest trace of shea butter, a smell he hadn't allowed near him in years. They lay still, two people separated by the vast gulf of class, status, and conscious intent, now bound together by the simplicity of human warmth and the storm outside. The bronze leopards guarded a boundary that had been breached not by rebellion, but by sleep. The night passed in absolute stillness, broken only by the sound of the rain and the slow, steady beat of two hearts now synchronized in the deep, forbidden quiet of the master suite. The transition from the storm's gray melancholy to Lagos' typical blazing morning sun was abrupt. At precisely 7 a.m., the massive generators of the mansion powered down with a gentle shudder, signaling the complete restoration of city power and the start of Femi Adebayo's rigorous day. Downstairs, the atmosphere was already tense. The head housekeeper, Mama Nkechi, was a woman of iron discipline, and Adana's absence was a jagged interruption to her perfect schedule. "Where is she, Adana?" Mama Nkechi snapped, the clack of her sensible shoes echoing in the marble hallway. She was dressed impeccably in her starched uniform, a tower of professional outrage. Bizi and Chioma shrugged nervously. "We checked the quarters, Ma. Her bed is empty." The door was unlocked. Mama Nkechi frowned, her suspicion mounting. The junior staff knew the rules. Had the new girl run off? Stolen something? Just then, Samuel, the valet, approached, carrying a tray that held Femi's morning ritual, a porcelain cup of espresso, the newspaper, and a small, sterile bottle of water. "Mama Nkechi, the master is expecting his delivery. Where is the new girl?" Samuel's voice was clipped with concern. If staff disappeared, Femi blamed the nearest manager. "She is missing," Mama Nkechi declared, her voice heavy. "Go and check the upper lounge, Samuel. I will take this tray." Holding the silver tray like a shield, Mama Nkechi took the floating staircase, her mind already composing the report she would have to give Femi, a report that would involve firing the new girl. Bizi and Chioma followed her, drawn by a morbid curiosity to see the infamous upper level. The three women reached the landing, their breath catching simultaneously as they stopped before the two bronze leopards. Beyond this point lay the absolute silence of the master's realm. "Look," Chioma whispered, pointing. The polished mahogany double doors of the master suite were not closed. They were slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible between them, indicating an unprecedented breach of security. Mama Nkechi's blood ran cold. This was worse than a missing maid. This was a direct, glaring failure. She pushed the tray into Bizi's hands. You two stay here. I will close it before Oga Femi notices. Heart pounding against her ribs, Mama Nkechi crept forward. She reached the door, placed her hand on the smooth wood, and pushed it open just enough to slip inside and latch it. The view that greeted her was not the usual sight of Femi, already dressed, working at his minimalist desk. The room was bathed in the warm, golden light streaming from the lagoon-facing windows. The light illuminated the massive walnut bed, which dominated the room. The espresso tray began to shake violently in Bizi's hands as she and Chioma peered in from the widening gap in the door. Oga Femi Adebayo, the Ice King, the Untouchable, was asleep. His powerful, muscular arm was draped across a small figure tucked tight against his body. Adana. She was nestled deep in the crook of his neck, her profile barely visible beneath the curve of his chin. The charcoal duvet was pulled high over them both, making them look like a single, sculpted form of intimacy. The staff saw Femi not as the ruthless CEO, but as a man in deep, peaceful slumber, his face softened, the habitual tension completely gone. He looked utterly vulnerable, and yet fiercely protective of the warm weight pressed against him. The shock was paralyzing, an emotional electric shock that short-circuited all logic. Mama Nkechi's professional outrage dissolved into pure, raw terror. She let out a small, sharp gasp, a noise like tearing cloth, that finally shattered the room's silence. Femi's eyes snapped open. He did not wake slowly. He was instantly fully alert. His dark eyes darted from the wide-eyed maids clustered in the doorway to the sleeping girl in his arms. He looked down at Adana. Her braids were scattered across his pillow, and her breathing was soft and deep against his collarbone. He looked back at the terrified, frozen faces of his staff, and a shadow of his waking authority returned. Mama Nkechi found her voice, a high-pitched, pleading squeak. Oga, sir. We found the door open. We were just... Femi's gaze was lethal, but his hand moved, not to push Adana away, but to instinctively stroke the hair near her ear. Clumsy, he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl, laced with a surprising tenderness. He pulled Adana a fraction closer, subtly shielding her from view. The coffee, sir. Mama Nkechi was weeping silently, convinced they were all about to be ruined. Put the coffee on the console, he repeated, his voice barely a whisper, yet commanding absolute obedience. And go. His eyes dropped back to Adana's face, his lips barely moving as he issued the final uncharacteristic instruction, a silent order that sealed their fate. Quietly. Don't wake her. Mama Nkechi, Bizi, and Chioma scrambled back, dropping the silver tray onto the console with a barely audible thunk. They retreated rapidly, closing the mahogany door with the utmost care, their world spinning on its axis. Outside on the landing they looked at each other, their faces pale. The iron rule had been broken, but the one who broke it was not the maid. It was the master himself, who, for the first time in years, was not alone. The mahogany doors clicked shut, plunging the master suite back into silence. The silence was heavier now, thicker with implication. Outside, the world was bustling, helicopters whirring over Lekki, horns blaring on the freeway, but in this room only two people existed. Femi did not move. He was still holding Adana. He felt the rapid, shallow drumming of her heart against his rib cage, a counterpoint to his own slow, steady beat. He was awake, fully aware, and yet he refused to release her. His mind, accustomed to processing complex financial data and navigating boardroom warfare, now wrestled with a completely illogical variable. The last time a woman had been this close to him, the intimacy had been weaponized, the aftermath catastrophic. But this was different. He stared down at her serene, sleeping face. She was so slight, so fragile. She smelled of the natural, earthy scent of shea butter, a scent that reminded him not of the synthetic, expensive perfumes of his past life, but of his grandmother's compound in Ibadan. It was innocent. It was grounding. He realized he hadn't slept this soundly in years. The warmth she provided wasn't just physical. It was a profound, restful presence that had settled the restless energy he always carried. He glanced at the bedside console where Samuel had placed the espresso. It was already cooling. Femi Adebayo was late for his day. His entire schedule, a monolithic structure of meetings, calls, and workouts, was crumbling because he was paralyzed, captivated by the weight of a young maid in his arms. Adana stirred. The warmth was suffocating, the sheets too soft, the pillow too high. She was comfortable, too comfortable. In the staff quarters, comfort was a luxury. Her bed was hard, the blankets thin. She opened her eyes, and the golden morning light blinded her. Her first thought was the wallpaper. The walls were not the stark white of the staff wing. They were textured, dark travertine stone. She registered the carpet. Thick, gray, silencing. Then she registered the weight, a heavy, possessive arm wrapped around her middle. And finally she registered the man. She froze. Her heart slammed against her ribs, a violent, panicked rhythm that threatened to break through her chest. Her eyes widened, tracing the sharp jawline, the dark stubble, and the strong brown neck that belonged to the one man in Lagos who could not, must not, touch her. Ogafemi. Adana let out a choked, silent scream. Her waking mind snapped into hyper-awareness, immediately comprehending the cataclysmic disaster. She was not just fired, she was ruined. She twisted, trying to scramble out of the iron grip, the expensive sheets tangling around her legs. "Hush," Femi said, his voice deep and calm, a sound that cut through her terror. It wasn't angry, it was merely an instruction. She thrashed harder, desperate to escape the physical evidence of her breach. "Let me go. Please, sir, I swear." Femi's grip tightened momentarily, just enough to immobilize her. He didn't use force but leverage. He held her eyes with his. His face was severe, but his eyes held an unreadable curiosity, not rage. "Stop. You are making noise. The entire staff knows you are here," he stated flatly. "If you try to bolt now, you will confirm that you were here with intent. Be still and talk to me." Adana collapsed against the pillow, trembling uncontrollably, tears spilling from her eyes. I didn't mean to, sir. I swear on my mother I didn't." Femi released her, allowing her to sit up, but he remained close, leaning on his elbow. The silence between them was immense, filled only with the sound of her ragged breathing. "Explain," he commanded, pulling his arm back and resting it on his knee. He looked utterly composed, as if this were a morning board meeting and Adana was a faulty asset. Adana struggled to compose herself, rubbing the tears from her eyes. I'm a sleepwalker, sir. A somnambulist. Since I was small. I locked myself in, but last night. The storm, the thunder, I think. I just walk when I'm cold or stressed. I was seeking heat." She watched his face, expecting disbelief, scorn, or fury. Femi absorbed the word, somnambulist. He cross-referenced it with the fact that his doors had been left unlocked during the power flicker. The puzzle pieces clicked into place. This was not calculated malice or gold-digging ambition. This was a biological error. An accident of fate. The anger he usually reserved for betrayal was absent. He felt only a strange, cold fascination. "So you are telling me," Femi said slowly, picking his words with surgical precision, "that you breached the most sacred rule of this house because your unconscious mind decided my bed was the warmest place in Lagos." Adana nodded frantically, burying her face in her hands. "Please, sir, don't fire me. I need this job. I will resign now, just please don't tell Mama Nkechi, she will ruin me." Femi watched her shake. He looked at the indentation she had left on his pillow, and the sudden vivid memory of the deepest sleep he'd had in years. He thought of the 2 hours he had spent holding her, and the absence of anxiety in that time. He stood up, walking toward the window. The city was sharp, vibrant, and demanding outside. He looked at his reflection in the glass, the image of the guarded fortress he had become. "Get up, Adana," he said, turning back to her. She scrambled off the bed, stumbling to the thick carpet, clutching the crumpled tunic of her face. "This is what is going to happen," Femi stated, his voice now back to the CEO tone, unnegotiable, final. "You will never speak of this to anyone. Not your family, but the other staff, they know already. You will not show any change in your behavior. You are the invisible maid. If I ever hear a rumor or see a knowing glance, or detect 1 second of hesitation in your work, you will be dismissed, and I will ensure you never find domestic work in Lagos again." Adana nodded, tears still streaming. "I promise, sir. I promise." "Good. Now listen closely." Femi walked to the door and checked the lock, ensuring it was firmly engaged. He turned back, his dark eyes fixed on her. "I need to work. You need to leave. Quietly. Samuel will be back in 30 minutes. You will descend the service stairs, enter the kitchen, and pretend you were there all morning." He paused, then added, his voice barely a breath, "But before you go, what time does your somnambulism typically occur?" Adana looked up, confused by the strange question. "Usually, sir. When the storm is heaviest. Between midnight and 3 a.m. Femi gave a single, sharp nod, his mind already calculating the risk. Understood. Now go. As Adana fled the room, moving like a panicked deer, Femi Adebayo stood in the center of his sanctuary. He ran a hand over the spot she had occupied, feeling the residual warmth. He had not fired her. He had created a dangerous secret. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that he would be leaving that electronic lock disengaged whenever the next storm rolled in. The aftermath of the morning discovery settled over the Adebayo mansion like a thick, choking fog. The house, usually a symphony of precise, silent luxury, now hummed with a dangerous, unspoken tension. The staff's burden. Downstairs, Mama Nkechi, Samuel, Bizi, and Chioma were united in their terror and confusion. They were bound by the most powerful deterrent in the house, Oga Femi's soft-spoken threat. If he could fire them for a broken vase, what would he do for witnessing the impossible? He did not even raise his voice, Mama Nkechi muttered to Samuel later, her hands scrubbing furiously at a perfectly clean countertop. That is the worst kind of anger. The silent one. Samuel, ever the pragmatist, could only agree. The rule is broken, but the rule remains. We forget what we saw. It was a glitch. The door was open, the girl was cold, Oga Femi was tired. End of story. But it was not the end of the story. It was the moment the house's foundation shifted. Every time Adana passed the others, they looked away, their terror mingling with a strange, respectful awe. She had survived the master suite and lived Adana's invisible life. Adana, meanwhile, became a ghost. She moved with a purpose that was almost desperate, determined to prove that the single act of sleepwalking was an anomaly. She cleaned the polished brass inlays in the concrete floor until they blinded the eye. She folded linens with surgical precision. She wanted to disappear into the fabric of the house. The memory of waking up in Femi's arms was a humiliation and a source of paralyzing fear. She avoided the floating staircase entirely, taking the dimly lit service elevator even for brief errands. She ate alone, worked alone, and spent her nights desperately trying to stay awake, fearful of what her body might do if left unsupervised. She secured her door with a rope tied to her bedpost, an archaic but necessary precaution. She lived in a constant state of dread, waiting for the inevitable summons. The moment Femi would decide that his secret was too much of a risk and dispense with her. Femi's new habit. But Femi Adebayo did not summon her. Instead, a new, subtle shift occurred in his routine. In his waking hours, Femi never directly looked at Adana. When he passed the kitchen, he continued to stare at his tablet. When he dictated instructions to Samuel, he never acknowledged the quiet girl polishing the high-gloss cabinetry nearby. Yet, Femi Adebayo began to observe. He noticed the way she moved, efficiently, silently, without the clumsy shuffling of the other maids. He noticed the dedication she put into restoring the natural sheen of the Irako wood. He noticed the simple, inexpensive shea butter scent that clung faintly to the air, a natural, unpretentious note in his overly synthetic environment. He noticed the deep, dark shadows beneath her eyes, a sign of her own fear and lack of sleep. He found himself thinking of her in moments of intense pressure. In a high-stakes meeting, when a deal threatened to collapse, he would subconsciously recall the profound, simple peace of that shared bed, a fleeting anchor in his turbulent existence. His fortress was still standing, but the walls now felt less necessary, more oppressive. The isolation he had cultivated felt less like protection and more like profound, aching emptiness. The second storm. 2 weeks passed, filled with relentless Lagos sunshine. Adana started sleeping a little better, convinced that the worst was over. Femi returned to his 5:30 a.m. routine, the trauma of the morning slowly receding into a strange, vivid dream. Then the weather changed. The forecast predicted a massive offshore squall, promising one of the heaviest downpours of the season, scheduled to hit Banana Island between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m. That evening, Femi worked late. He dismissed Samuel after checking the security logs and confirming the house was secured. He stood in the middle of his silent, cavernous bedroom, looking at the mahogany doors. He had demanded privacy, demanded isolation, and demanded control. He had built the house, the empire, and the rule to enforce that control. He walked to the bedside console, his expression unreadable, and checked the status of the electronic lock. It was engaged. He didn't need to do this. The risk was enormous. He was the master of discipline, the architect of his own loneliness. But the thought of another night of restless, solitary sleep in his fortress, knowing the source of genuine, effortless peace was locked away on the floor below, was suddenly unbearable. He pressed the console button, overriding the night security protocol. The electronic lock thunked softly, disengaging the bolt. Femi walked back to the bed. He climbed in, leaving the vast space on the right side empty, waiting for a force outside of his control. He stared at the ceiling panels, listening to the first distant rumble of thunder. He didn't want to admit it, but he was waiting for the girl who had no choice but to break his rules. He closed his eyes, and for the first time since that morning, Femi Adebayo smiled a slow, dangerous, satisfied smile into the dark. The waiting game had begun.